Hi again, everyone. Welcome to a very special episode of Men Talk. And I've having a blast with this season. I think I've got probably the most eclectic mix of people come on, and today's is no different. It's someone who has been able to marry two of my great loves together. If anyone who's followed any of my work, watched any of these shows, you'll know that music is such a big part of my life. It's been a great source of inspiration for my own writing. I got someone on today who, writes about musicians, and I don't think you can get much better than this. He's written some books about some of the biggest names, I would say some of the biggest bands you would have heard of in the music industry. One in particular, which we'll get into, which is a personal interest of mine. I welcome to the show Richard Houghton. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, Chris. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, this again. I've said this a few episodes this season. Really, I'm loving at the moment, just discovering people whose work kind of lands on my newsfeed just randomly. Yours is a little bit different because the book that brought me to you, which we will go over, I'll flash it up. There we go. Lend me your ears. Okay, the fan history of Jethro Tull. For obvious reasons, people who know me know I am a very big Jethro Tull fan. I knew about this book anyway, which was fantastic. And then it was only kind of through chance that I found you through a mutual Facebook group and was able to get in touch with you. So this isn't as random as some of the others may have been. This is actually being able to get you on is fantastic for me because, like I say, I already had an interest in something you've done. One thing I'd like to kind of touch on to begin with, just to kind of lay the groundwork for people who may not, know your work yet, is the books that you do. They're from a slightly different angle. You're not necessarily telling the story of the artist necessarily. You're telling it through the fans. Which, tell us a little bit about that firstly, and sort of, how I suppose that appealed to you or came about in particular.
Okay, well, I'm a big Rolling Stones fan. I'm 62, and I went to see the Stones in 2014 in Stockholm with my then 18-year-old son. Right. And the Stones had just clocked up 50 years, I think 52 years at the time. And I was thinking about the audience, given that I was I was middle-aged myself, and a lot of people were older than me. And I got to thinking that there were a lot of people who'd been following the Stones for 50 years, had seen them from the outset back in 1962. Being a big Stones fan, I also collect books about the Rolling Stones, and I've got over 200 different titles, which is by no means the full set. Many people have got many, many more titles than me. Yeah. But I was conscious that having collected 200 different books about the Stones, nobody told the story of the band from the perspective of the fans. Right. They're either from the inside circle, such as Keith Richards' autobiography, Ronnie Wood's autobiography, Bill Wyman's autobiography, or they are from the inner circle in some capacity, a journalist who's worked with them, or they're often, and this is true of lots of other bands too, I guess, they're rehashes of other books. So you pick up a brand new book and you start reading it and you think, I've read this story before. Because they're recycling old press cuttings, or they're recycling old concert reviews. But I was thinking then, well, there's all these people out there who saw the Stones back in the early 60s when they had Brian Jones in the lineup. Mm-hmm. It's in the days before YouTube, before smartphones, because now you go to a gig, everybody gets their phone out.
Of it, haven't you? Yeah.
Yeah, and by the time you get home, it's all over YouTube.
Yeah.
Pretty much watch the whole concert, filmed by however many individuals were there. That didn't exist in the 60s, and those memories that people made of concerts back then were either written down in their diary when they got home, or they were told to their family or friends, but otherwise they didn't exist. Right. And I just thought it'd be really nice to try and capture some of those memories of the Stones 50 years before and try and tell their story in a different way.
That's great.
So it might be how a record impacted on somebody's life, or it might be how going to see the Stones, or often it's about how it was marked a significant moment in that person's life, whether it was a tune played at the wedding or whether it was on the first date with somebody, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So trying to mix a bit of the personal with the musical history.
I love that, and that resonates. All of that resonates with me. You know, the first time I've seen a band, or you get your favorite gigs and something that really means something. There's artists, and there's albums out there which I associate with pivotal parts of my life, which I still go back to. You know, and they I think they'll always be there for sentimental value, apart from the fact that they're great as well. Was there anything? So we'll come back to that. But for yourself, was there anything like that before you got to the stage of wanting to write about it? Were there sort of seminal records or moments and that you'd witnessed that sort of stay with you from your own experience?
Well, the very first concert I went to was the Beatles at Hammersmith Odeon, the Beatles Christmas show 1964.
Okay.
Whether I was 4 years old and have no memory of it. I went with my parents, basically.
Right.
My mum was a big pop music fan, although my dad was not quite so bothered. First musical memory I've really got is seeing T-Rex doing Hot Love on Top of the Pops in the spring of 1970. Hot Love was #1 for 6 weeks, so you couldn't escape it.
No.
And as it happens, I was in hospital at the time because I had chronic asthma as a child.
Right.
And I remember Thursday nights in the hospital ward was a big deal because we all wanted to watch Top of the Pops, and the nurses had a devil of a job sort of lining up the chairs and getting us all in position because everybody wanted prime position to be able to watch the telly.
Of course.
But it was a big communal event, and I just have a clear memory of that.
That's cool.
Again, because my dad wasn't really a pop music fan, we didn't particularly have pop radio on in the house before. Yeah. But after that, I've got, I remember buying my first record, which was Resurrection Shuffle by Ashton, Gardner and Dyke.
Okay, not one I'm familiar with, but okay.
Well, it's quite an unusual choice, I suppose, but got to #1, I think. Okay. Anyway, I remember trading that at school for something else when I was about 15, and the person who swapped it with me was horrified when they listened to it because it being my first ever single, it was scratched to death.
We've all got that.
I'd absolutely, I played it 24/7 when I first got it, and there was hardly anything left.
That's what they're made for, though, isn't it? I do wonder with some people. It's great, when you get to a certain age and you want to collect the old stuff and keep it pristine. But back at the time, that's exactly what they're there for. So they're there to be enjoyed, aren't they? So
yeah. I mean, and I've got other records. I've got a copy of "Come Taste the Band" by Deep Purple.
Okay.
And my best friend bought that album, took it back to the local record shop because he said it had a scratch on it. A couple of days later, I went to the record shop and bought what I believe is the very same copy of that album.
Okay.
Mine has a scratch on it. But, I can't listen to that album now without that click on the opening track. If I hear it without the click, it doesn't sound right.
No, that's true.
For me, it's part of the music.
Yeah. That's what you've grown up with. That's brilliant. So sort of you started with the Rolling Stones, the book about the Rolling Stones. That was your first one that you did
yes.
And got published. Just take us through the process then, because as I'm a writer myself of fiction, so I know sitting down, mapping out an idea, and you just kind of run with it. When you're writing something based on other people's experiences, just give us a sense of what that's like to put together. How do you compile the stories firstly, and then how do you choose order, which ones make it, that kind of thing?
Well, the Stones book, so like I say, it was 2014, and 50 years before, in 1964, the Stones were still touring quite heavily in the UK and playing places like Watford, Gaumont, or venues of that sort of size. They were moving out of the clubs and dance halls and into theatres. And they did their first US tour that year as well. So it just happened to coincide with the 50th anniversary of them playing certain towns. What I did was write to local newspapers and say, 50 years ago this month, the Rolling Stones were in town. Would you be interested in a feature on this? And some newspaper editors said, yeah, write us a piece and we'll publish it. And some said, well, if you send us a letter, we'll put it in our letters column and put people in touch with you that way. So I did a shout out, to just about every local newspaper in Britain, because the Stones played just about everywhere between 62 and 66. And then people contacted me, and they either wrote to me and sent me their memories, or they said, here's my telephone number, please give me a ring, I'd be happy to chat.
That's cool.
Sometimes them writing was better because you've actually got their words, and they've not had to think about it. And sometimes it was me interviewing them, and of course there is a temptation sometimes to ask leading questions because you know where you want the interview to go. Be careful not to do too much of asking and what was Mick Jagger wearing kind of question every time, because otherwise you end up with the same story. Everybody remembers that Mick was wearing a white shirt or was wearing
that's about it.
So that's how I did it. And then in terms of the order, well, the book's a chronology. So it starts in 1962 with them playing at the Marquee. It ends on the 5th of July 1969, which was the Hyde Park concert they played 2 days after Brian Jones had died. And that seemed like a good point to end the book, because Mick Taylor had been recruited to replace Brian, and they went off on a US tour that autumn, and it was a whole new era of the Stones. So the Brian Jones era, if you like, I felt was bookended by their debut in the Marquee, and then ending in Hyde Park with Brian having died just a couple of days before.
And like you say, it represents a without trying to sum up their entire story, which probably would take multiple volumes, focusing on one era, you're going to have a lot of people that probably either are interested in finding out more if they weren't around then, or ones that wanted to relive those memories that they may have had, by picking that up. So so then from there on, how did it lead to more? Because you've done, looking at sort of the number that you've done done a fair shake, loads of different bands and that. What was your kind of direction from the Rolling Stones one? Did you know other ones that you wanted to do, or were you then sort of approached to do them eventually?
Well, I think what was interesting about the Stones and that the era is it was obviously way before Ticketmaster and having to buy your concert ticket weeks or months in advance. It was before pop radio. Radio 1 didn't start until 1967. There was very little pop music actually played on the BBC. There were no commercial radio stations. So teenagers went to dances, they went to dance halls, and they would just go every Tuesday night to their local club. And they might see the Stones, but they wouldn't necessarily know in advance who was playing. It might be the Stones, it might be the Who, it might be the Kinks. Although the Beatles were, booked in advance for the bands that followed immediately after, it was still a case of going out and playing to get your music heard. So some of the people I talked to had seen everybody. And when I asked them about the Stones, they said, well, let me tell you about the Beatles, because I saw them too. So I started out collecting material about the Rolling Stones, and at the end of it, I had 25% of the material towards a Beatles book.
How cool is that?
And given, there's always that Beatles or Stones sort of dynamic about who did you support as a teenager in the 60s, it just seemed the obvious step to do that, the biggest band in the world. And I've got memories of seeing the Beatles before they were famous. There's a great story in the Beatles book about a guy who'd hired them for a village hall up in Scotland, and it was a young farmers do. And the young farmers weren't interested in the pre-fame Beatles. They were interested in getting absolutely smashed and trying to pick up the local girls. And there were beer bottles being thrown around and all the rest of it. And this guy who'd promoted the concert retreated upstairs to escape the mayhem because he realised he couldn't control the unruly masses. But he got to hear one of the very first versions of She Loves You, because they played it that night. They'd only just recorded it. And, he was privileged and sober enough to remember hearing it.
And that's the kind of thing you want, isn't it, really? I mean, any of these memories are great, but if you've got one or two of those almost like historic moments, that people didn't know were historic at the time, and then you can look back on. That's brilliant. That's fantastic. Cool. So so trying to tackle one, then, I mean, what a way to start with your first two, trying to tackle two of the biggest ones. If I was to say, out of everyone that you've done, this is probably a really harsh question. Do you have one that's dearest to you? You know, either because you were a fan yourself, you know, it meant a lot to have the book out there, or one that was more fun to do. You know, if you had to pick one out of your collection that you've done.
Well, the third one I did was then a book on the Who.
Okay.
And again, it seemed like a natural step, one of the other biggest bands of the 60s. And the Who, if it was possible, were even more relentless in their gigging than the Stones were.
Right.
Because they were playing 6 and sometimes 7 nights a week, sometimes 2 shows in the same day. And, you know, bands would often rock up at their managers' offices in the morning to be told off to send a phone call from such and such. Somebody's cancelled. Can you get up to Warrington? Or you're going to be playing in Newcastle tonight. So they didn't know beforehand where they were going to be playing.
Okay.
There'd be little or no pre-promotion, or they'd turn up and the audience were actually expecting the Yardbirds or something, and the Who were deafening for them. And even though the Who's concert history has been extensively chronicled, I actually managed to find 3 concerts that had never been recorded before.
Wow.
So there was one in Stevenage where I'd got a date for it, and a woman wrote in and said, "Oh, I saw him on such and such a date in Stevenage." And I said, "Oh, yeah, no, I've got details of that. I think it's the Locarno Ballroom in Stevenage. But you've got the date wrong."
Right.
And she said, "No, I haven't. It's written in my diary." And she sent me a scan of her diary.
Oh, wow.
So they'd actually played the same venue 2 weeks before, but it had never been published before. And I found a couple of other concerts like that, where I was able to verify from the information people gave me that the Who had played a show that wasn't in other books about the Who.
Wow.
I also found a show that 3 different people could all remember going to at Wem Town Hall in Shropshire,
right,
but none of them could agree on the date. And when I wrote to Wem Town Hall to ask, they said, "Well, we can't help you because our records were destroyed in a fire several years ago." So that the Who played Wem Town Hall doesn't seem to be in dispute, but exactly when it was, even down to the year, is a mystery yet to be solved.
Well, there you go. So at least you got that far. I mean, you know, obviously further than some records did, or any records did by the time you got there. You felt a sense of achievement. You got to with something like that when you kind of, unknowingly or not, added a little bit more to their history, because there's got to be plenty of people out there who do what you do, maybe not, you know, but you know, for the reasons you do it, but because they're interested, who would be thankful for, you know, being able to fill those gaps almost. So that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the bands themselves don't remember, or they're reliant on their road manager or somebody in the crew who will have kept diaries, who will have kept a log of all the journeys, or somebody in the management team. But as we get older, you know, fewer and fewer of those people are around.
Yeah.
And sometimes records get thrown away because people don't recognise the value of that old exercise book in the bottom of a shoebox.
Yeah.
That might have actually included lots of historic information that was of value to us.
To someone, yeah. So it's really just trying to capture that as soon as this kind of information comes available, like you're doing, putting it in a form which, touch wood, you know, will always be around in some form or fashion once it's out there. And I'll bring you on while we've got a bit of time. Then I will bring you on to this one in particular, like I say, because I have a personal interest in it, and this was the one that really got my attention. And I mean, this is the first of your books that I've seen. And if this is anything to go by, I don't know how much this sort of translates, but for people to, I mean, it is a beautiful bit of work. And,
thank you.
You know, it's so rich in information. What I haven't sat down and gone through it cover to cover yet, because I've not had quite the time since it's arrived until I speak to you. But such, you know, I mean, it looks like it's one that you can pick up. You know, you can delve into. You know, there's the stories are digestible, and there's, just to give you a sense of how much is in here. Really, if you just flick through and just see how many names pop out of people that have contributed to it. Just sort of give us a rundown then of how this one in particular came about, and sort of any memories that you've got about putting the Lend Me Your Ears together.
Okay, so I have got my own publishing company called Spenwood Books. So I've published several titles through that. But I also write books for a company called This Day Music Books. Mm-hmm. And they published a Jethro Tull book. So they published a couple of my other books. I did a book on Simple Minds. I did one on orchestral maneuvers in the dark. Mm-hmm. And Jethro Tull, Ian's management were interested in the idea because it was against a different angle to the usual way of doing it. And if somebody contributes a story to the book, there's a chance that they'll buy the book. Yeah. There's a chance they might buy several copies of the books. They want to give them as gifts to their family.
Yeah.
So in practical terms, if you can pull together 500 stories, then you might sell 300 books off the bat, just to people who've got a story in the book, because their name's recorded for posterity, and and they want to see their name in print.
Absolutely.
And so that was how it came about. With some of the books I've done, it's purely fan stories.
Yeah.
But with the Jethro Tull book, James, Ian's son, who's also his manager, actually reached out to lots of people, and they agreed to contribute memories. So you've got several former members of Jethro Tull who've put stories in there.
And I was just saying, you've got some guys, from big names in the music business as well, who have contributed to this. I mean, Jethro Tull, I discovered them. I'm quite late to the party, really. I mean, if I say it's 10 years that I've been a fan of theirs, I mean, that's obviously only a snippet of their history. And I mean, this book, does it cover, what sort of time span does it cover throughout it? Is it sort of the entire history, or a bit like you've done before? But
it goes back to the very beginning. I mean, Ian was kind enough to do an interview with me, and so I got him to talk a little bit about his childhood and his first musical memories, growing up in Blackpool, and the roots of the band and the move down to London, the involvement in the rock and roll circus. He had a little story about Brian Jones and the Rolling Stones, how because Jethro Tull famously played at the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, which was a televised show which the Stones taped, I think with the intention of being able to create a load of promo videos to save them having to go and perform live on TV shows. Yeah. But Mick Jagger was not satisfied with the Stones' final performance, so the tapes gathered dust for about 20 years. Yeah. But Jethro Tull appeared as one of the supporting acts, and Tony Iommi of Black Sabbath was very briefly in Jethro Tull, so he appears in that video. So Ian talked a little bit about how Tony got that gig. They needed a guitarist for the TV show. Yeah. They were miming anyway, so Tony agreed to do it, so he didn't have to learn any guitar parts.
What could have been? That's one of their aspects of their history I'm most fascinated with. What could have been? Could have been? Don't know. Would they have been? What direction could they have gone with Tony Iommi? But sorry, carry on.
Well, what I think is really interesting about that is Tony, because I've read his autobiography, said that those 2 weeks in Jethro Tull were really instructional for him, because Ian rehearsed the band quite rigorously every day. They would start at 9 o'clock in the morning, they would rehearse properly. And when he went back to Black Sabbath, having decided he was missing his mates, one of the things he decided was they couldn't lie in bed all day and then just show up for gigs and hope it'd all work. They'd got to actually start practicing properly. Yeah. And he took that work ethic away from the 2 weeks he spent with Jethro Tull.
There you go. And the rest is history, as they say.
Yes.
So I've got to ask then, because obviously, I think Ian Anderson is on my list of, I've got sort of 3 or 4 guys who have really inspired in my writing. You know, where I said at the beginning that music and my writing, I would sit in the early days when I was trying to write stuff, and I would have music on the background. I'd take all kinds of inspiration from what I was hearing. There's two guys who lyrically have inspired me the most. You know, Christopher is one of them, and Ian Anderson, because I think between them, the stories in their songs are so rich and just so individual that it's just kind of, I would sit and I would listen to them. I think the guy's a genius. What was it like then, sort of talking to Ian Anderson? I've got to ask a kind of fanboy question there.
Well, you say talking to Ian Anderson, that implies it was a two-way conversation.
Okay.
I had 10 questions written down, and an hour and 10 minutes into the interview, we only got through 2 of them because, and I don't mean this in at all a critical way,
no.
but he does not stop. He tells a story, and he tells a very good story. His recall is excellent.
Yeah.
He's very self-deprecating, so he'll explain what he's talking about. He'll make a joke about himself. He'll move on, and you're just listening to him is fascinating. I mean, he could be on TV just telling stories, and it would
Absolutely.
be fantastic. And I think that's just reflects what you're saying about his lyrics. Really, he not only does he write a good story, he's a fantastic narrator as well.
He is, yeah. And performer-wise, I find him mesmerising just watching him perform. You know, he's a different person than if you sit down and you hear him talk. You know, he's a real character. Yeah.
One of the things we talked about, because there was a little bit of interaction, was when Tull first went to America and Led Zeppelin were breaking through in the States. And this is covered in the book a little bit, how Ian, stood in the audience and watched Zepp go through their paces and picked up a few things about performance and stage presence that he then took to Jethro Tull's show. And the theatricality of what Tull did, particularly in the early years, is something that a lot of fans comment on in the book. It wasn't just a couple of smoke bombs, some flashing lights, and the music. And different stage shows like the Unwrapped tour, where he did different things, and people were still talking about that stagecraft 35, 40 years later.
Yeah. How many have they inspired, of the acts that have been around sort of 20, 30 years now? I think they've crossed over almost like a couple of generations, I think, in when they've been around. And the one thing I absolutely love about Jethro Tull is how every album I've heard, I mean, it sounds different. They've almost evolved. They're one of those bands that have evolved with the time really, really well. I will admit it's probably a controversial thing, but the period I prefer is kind of around sort of Stormwatcher and up to Christopher Nave and Catfish Rising. I quite like the later stuff. Starting off as a bit of a metal fan, so I was in sort of the harder rock sense, but his sound changed. There's some songs where I liken him to Dire Straits. They had a very, very similar sound, but then you go back to their early stuff, it's completely different. But I love that because there's such a depth in what they've done. You could go back to any album, any era of theirs, and have something different. A few bands like that, I think.
Yeah. I was also lucky enough to talk to Mick Abrahams, who, he's had a stroke and he's really not been very well. I think he's in a retirement home now, but he was very kind enough to sort of grant me an interview, which we did over Zoom. And he was saying that the split after the first album was very much because he wanted to go or carry on in the sort of blues direction that first album was. Ian had a clear and different vision for the group, and you couldn't fit the two of them together, which is why Mick went on to form Bloodwind Pig, and Ian obviously is the main songwriter, wanted to go in a different direction. Ian also told a very amusing story about how Chris Wright of Chrysalis told Ian that Mick was the main man and Ian, should stay in the background, which, as Ian said, wasn't going to happen, basically.
No. You see, you try and catch that. It's like catching lightning in a bottle, I would imagine.
Yes.
Trying to harness what he would do on stage. You can't replicate that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. No, and I cannot wait to delve into this book more. It's going to be one of those I think I'll just keep going back to, because there's definitely so much stuff I could take from that. And your other library of stuff that and just mention some of the bands, if you will, just take a moment and just kind of give everyone a flavor of the guys, aside from those that you've mentioned already, the Beatles and the Stones. Who else have you written about?
Well, I've done Pink Floyd. I've done Jimi Hendrix. I've got a book coming out in a couple of weeks, which is again about the Rolling Stones, but the Rolling Stones 1972 North American tour.
Okay.
Which is kind of notorious because it's captured in a couple of films and involved a lot of backstage hijinks involving drugs and groupies, and
okay.
Film which I won't use the name of because it may not be suitable for family broadcast.
No, that's cool.
But it's a film that the Stones commissioned, which Mick Jagger commissioned, but which, when he saw the rough cut of it, said could never be broadcast. And so the director was only ever allowed to show it, I think, 4 times a year, and had to be present when it was shown. So effectively, it never had a proper commercial release, but you can find it on YouTube.
Right, okay.
Stones realised that if that was seen by the authorities in the US, they'd never tour there again because they'd never get visas to visit. I've done a book on Cream.
Oh, yeah. Cool.
And, that was kind of, because a bit like Hendrix, it was wanting to fill in those gaps in the 60s. So I've done most of the major acts of the 60s.
It's like a who's who at the minute, I will say.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, I'd love to do the Yardbirds, and I'd love to do Free as well, because I think that, and then Peter Green era Fleetwood Mac. But then you can go on and on. There's always somebody else you can do.
I was going to ask that actually. Yeah, have you got a wish list of ones that you would want to still tick off?
Yeah, well, next year, I've got the material for a book about the Faces with Rod Stewart.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping to do a book about Slade as well, because Slade is kind of my era. When I was a kid, Slade were all over the charts.
Yeah.
So one of the very first records after that Ashton Gardner and Dyke single that I remember buying was My Friend Stan by Slade. Okay. In fact, I didn't buy it. I think you could cut out vouchers off the back of a packet of hula hoops or something and post 8 of those off to KP, and you got a single sent through the post.
Oh, still had some of those days when I was younger. Yeah, I remember the joy of that, and then waiting for it to land. It's brilliant. That's fantastic.
And I've also just had a book published about Fairport Convention.
I was going to ask about that.
Which is authorised by the band. So, and that came about because of the Jethro Tull book. So I interviewed Dave Pegg, about his time in Jethro Tull. So he knew what the construct of the book was, that it was a story from eyewitness accounts.
Yeah.
And just as a throwaway comment, I said to him, if you'd be interested in doing a book about Fairport in the same way, just give me a shout. And he came straight back to me and said, I'd love you to do a book on Fairport. And that came out last week. So
there you go, fresh hot off the press, as they say.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. And I think there's definitely, after this, there's definitely enough to send people away to discover and sample of yours. I mean, any music fan worth their salt will find probably somebody that you've written about that they want to find out more. Like I say, there's stories that I've sat down, I've read autobiographies and biographies, loads of them, but these ones particularly do appeal to me now, because it's just that other dimension of, I know what I've got from certain bands, like I say, all these pivotal points in my life that are represented by a certain song, an album, whatever, and other people out there obviously have their own, and the fact that we can access those in works like this is truly fantastic. So
well, I think that you've put your finger on it there, really, because if you were to give me a story, for example, about the Faces, if you'd seen them, but I'm gathering you're just a little bit too young.
Yeah, you're not my
but if you did, you would be telling me a little bit about yourself as well. And your story then would be a little bit about the Faces, but a bit about yourself and how you got into them. And I think that's why the book chimes with people, because somebody else would read your story and think, well, that's interesting because I remember that song on the radio too, or I was at that concert, or I saw that tour,
Yeah.
and that's part of the appeal. It's the Jethro Tull book is 500 different mini life stories in a way, all fitted together with Jethro Tull running through the middle of it.
And it's fantastic, a fantastic idea. I mean, I say to some people before, I've got my books, I started off writing horror, and when I say for one of my earliest works, it gets amongst my readers gets the most sort of recognition, I suppose, and notoriety. I'm asked where I come up with the character, and it's actually that one story was it was two Christopher songs that I mashed together, and and I wrote a horror story on it. It's not really these association people on paper would put together, but it's the effect those songs had on me, on what then happened in my mind and what came out on the paper. So it's everyone's got those, traveling through certain points of their life through the music, and absolutely brilliant. So finally, before I let you go, then just let everyone know, after we told everyone about how that they need to go out and find you and your books, where can they find you and buy your books?
So, well, most of them are on Amazon, but you can also find them or details about them on spenwoodbooks.com. And if people think, well, I like the books, but I don't really want to pay postage, and neither do I want to put money into the hands of Amazon, you can always go into your local bookshop and order the books there.
Cool. Let's do it the old-fashioned way. Much prefer that. Absolutely. Richard, this has been absolute delight having you on. Thank you so much for your time. This has been, I really appreciate you coming on and talking more. And I could probably sit and I can pick your brain for days on end, but I'm gonna let the books speak for themselves for now, and I'll let everyone else do the same. So yeah, all the best with everything that you've got coming out, and that you've got in the works. And everyone, get out there and pick up 1, 2, however many of Richard's books to see if any of your memories are in there. So thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Chris.
Cheers. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, share, and hit the subscribe button. Also follow us on Facebook and Instagram to keep updated about all future shows.